Members of Parliament, distinguished guests, and dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's seminar on the European Union support to organizations in Cuba and the PDCA agreement, the political dialogue and cooperation agreement between the European Union and Cuba. The agreement was signed on 12th of December in 2016 and was approved by the Parliament on the 5th of July in 2017. After that, all EU member states, except Lithuania, have ratified the agreement. However, the agreement has not led to improvements of the situation of the human rights in Cuba. On the contrary, there are today over 1,400 political prisoners in Cuba. The European Union also funds various development projects which critics claim are supportive of repression and flawed totalitarian institutions. Currently, the EU is reportedly funding 80 projects in Cuba to the value of 155 million euros. The funding is directed to organizations linked to the regime. However, most of the EU's support goes through the UN, which brokers the funds. This is happening at the same time when the Cuban dictatorship doesn't allow special rapporteurs for human rights to travel to Cuba, to visit political prisoners, activists, or self-employed Cubans. UN aid is also accused of being used by the regime against the population. During the Swedish presidency of the European Council, I raised a question with the Minister for International Development Cooperation and Foreign Trade, Mr. Johan Forsell, and in his answer to the written question, he opened up to a review of the agreement. Unfortunately, he couldn't participate in this seminar today, and the government chose to not send another representative, which I completely regret. But in this discussion panel later on, we will have parliamentarians from other government parties participating. This seminar addresses criticism of both the agreement and EU funding. What is the way forward? Does Cuba actually live up to the agreement with the European Union? And is the support from the EU that the UN mediates misused? During today's seminar, we will touch upon these important questions. We will listen to some of the most prominent experts on these issues and hear what they have to say. Once again, I welcome you to this important seminar, and now I give the floor to today's moderator, Ms. Isabelle Eriksson, journalist at the Swedish Online Media Bulletin. Please, Isabelle, you have the floor.
Thank you, Björn Söder, for this introduction. Yeah, we have a lot of interesting speakers here today, and we have a time schedule to follow, so I will introduce each one of you, and after that we will have a panel discussion. And today our first speaker is Orlando Guterres Boronat, National Secretary for the Cuban Directorate and Coordinator for the Assembly of Cuban Resistance. Warm welcome.
Thank you. It is a great honor to be here in the Riksdag, and I want to thank Congressman Björn Söder for organizing this event, and Marcos Vigil and the other members of Congress who are here present. This event is another step towards the necessary review of the agreement between the European Union and the totalitarian dictatorship that exists in Cuba for the past 64 years. And it is a fact that we can demonstrate that the EU financing of the totalitarian regime in Cuba, far from leaning towards democracy, has helped repression in Cuba, has allowed the regime to evade sanctions and to increase its repression of the Cuban people. But also, in spite of the great EU financing of this regime, the regime has moved towards an ever closer relationship with the Putin regime in Russia, to the point that is already in news that there are Cuban troops in Belarus and also joining the Russian army in the occupation of Ukraine. Today, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Ukrainian Parliament called for the closing of the Cuban embassy and the expulsion of Cuban diplomats because of their participation, the participation of the Castro regime in the aggression and occupation of Ukraine. So we ask ourselves, whose side is the European Union on? Is it on the side of Putin and the communist dictatorship in Cuba, or is on the side of the Cuban people, who have repeatedly demonstrated for their freedom and the recuperation of their liberty. Okay. During the last few months, a dozen representatives of the Russian government have visited Cuba to establish new agreements, military, economic, social, political, with the regime existing in Cuba. As we speak now, the Prime Minister of the dictatorship in Cuba is in Moscow signing 4 more agreements with the Putin regime. They are full participants in the aggression and occupation of Ukraine. Why is the European Union financing this? In addition to the repression of the Cuban people, this regime is participating actively in the occupation of Ukraine. And I will repeat it several times during my presentation. Please excuse me for it, but I think that message needs to be driven home to the European Union, that it is incoherent to stand with Ukraine and sanction the Putin regime and at the same time finance one of the main international allies or puppets of this Putin regime in Latin America. Cuban troops are being trained in Belarus. This is not a rumor. It has been made public by the Russian official media. It has been made public by the Cuban state-owned media. Here are the photographs of the signing of the agreement for the training of troops. And also, so-called Cuban volunteers are joining the Russian army for fighting in Ukraine. There's already videos of these individuals. This is the same method that was used by the Castro regime in Angola. When it occupied the African nation of Angola, they claimed that the Cuban troops were volunteers in the Angolan army. And this is just to circumvent international laws on the use of mercenaries and occupation forces. Again, why is the European Union financing this? It's incoherent. It undermines the alliance with the United States. It undermines the international front of democracies against the Beijing-Moscow axis. Here are some photographs of the Cuban troops in Ukraine participating in the aggression against the people of Ukraine. Supposedly these pictures were taken near Bakhmut. On a May 30th, 2023 interview, Diaz-Canel said that his regime condemned and rejected NATO's expansion as a form of aggression against Russia. Tell me how NATO expansion doesn't include Sweden. So they're condemning also the entry of Sweden into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Esteban Lasso, the president of the puppet parliament in Cuba, blamed European Spanish colonization for wheat scarcity in Cuba. If this were not so tragic, I would laugh. Cuba fed itself before 1959. Cubans consumed 85% Cubans grew 85% of what they consumed in Cuba. Today, 85% of what Cubans eat comes from the United States. The Castro regime has been part of the campaign of disinformation on the invasion of Ukraine, directed at Latin American users, blaming Europe and the US for the aggression of the Russians against Ukraine. And this is one of the ads which the regime websites have been disseminating. Ukraine is not being invaded, is what that says. In the United Nations, the diplomacy of the communist dictatorship in Cuba has consistently stood with the Russian Federation against the people of Ukraine. Russia is quickly moving to establish a series of military bases in Cuba. It is possible that just as Russian tactical nuclear weapons have been moved into Belarus, they could try to move them into Cuba as part of further pressure against the United States and NATO. Why is the European Union part of this? On which side is the European Union in a crisis that is becoming worse and worse by the day? The Putin regime is actively working to help the Castro regime circumvent sanctions, to finance the repression of the Cuban people, to finance the organizations of the Cuban regime responsible for repression. These are all facts. We have the documents, we have the numbers, we can show that this is taking place now. The European Union, again, should not be part of this. These are minimal statistics. There are over 1,000 political prisoners in Cuba. No one really knows how many political prisoners are in Cuba. Only the regime knows. We gather names as they come to us. Many people are afraid to say that their family members are in prison, but we know for sure that over 1,000, possibly over 1,500 people are in prison in Cuba for speaking out for change. 2,000 citizens have been detained since July 11th, 2011, when the Cuban people protested. And here are some additional facts about the repression that the Cuban people have suffered in their ongoing national uprising against this regime. Protests recently took place in large cities in Cuba's eastern provinces, and there continue to be protests every day in different manners throughout the island. So the Cuban people are struggling for change. They are struggling for freedom. The EU has 80 projects in Cuba for 155 million euros. Who runs these projects? Organizations controlled by the communist regime in Cuba. Has this opened social pluralism or political pluralism in Cuba? No. None of this has taken place. Cuba is not a freer place. It's not a more open place since this agreement began. It's regressed. It's more repressive, more dangerous, more closely aligned with Russia. The Cuban military is even more in control of the Cuban economy. It's even more in control of the daily life of Cubans. And again, how do they finance this repression on a daily basis? European money. The European Union funds are going directly to organizations like the Federation of Cuban Women, like the ANAP, and others who are directly responsible for repression in Cuba using the guise of social organizations. Additionally, educational institutions supported by the European Union have been known to expel students for thinking or manifesting dissident ideas within their educational format. So these institutions are also part of the repression. It is a fact that the European donations channeled through the United Nations are political tools of the Cuban communist regime. If human rights is an essential element of the agreement, and this is how the agreement was sold to Europe, this is why European countries signed on. They said the agreement would help contribute to a better human rights climate in Cuba. If that was truthfully the core of the agreement, then the agreement has been violated wildly, in a repugnant fashion. There is no way that anyone can prove that this agreement has led to a better human rights conditions and environment in Cuba. On the contrary. So this calls for a revision of this agreement. And this revision should begin as soon as possible. Sweden has the moral standing, Sweden has the history of monitoring human rights in Cuba necessary to begin this process of review as the head of the European Union. There are no long-term incentives given to this regime to improve its human rights condition. The message they received is that no matter what they do, the European Union will continue financing this regime. This is the most dangerous of messages. So again, I have repeated the same message over and over again. This is not something we are improvising or coming up with. These are facts. These are facts that sadly demonstrate a dangerous incoherence in the European Union's foreign policy towards Latin America. And not to say what the financing of this regime does for the oppression of the Nicaraguan people, the oppression of the Venezuelan people, the oppression of the Bolivian people. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And now we will have Joel Brighto, and he will present a video message from Ivan Hernandez Carrillo.
Thank you so much. It is an honor for me to introduce Ivan Hernandez Carrillo. He's the president of the Independent Trade Union Association of Cuba. Ivan was sentenced to 25 years in prison. His crime was defending the rights of Cuban workers to have free trade unions. His works denouncing before the International Labour Organization has led this organization to present the case 3271 the Cuban Association Trade Union versus the Cuban regime. Ivan sent us a message about the position regarding the political agreement between the European Union and Cuba and his recommendation on this agreement. The International Labour Organization has requested the Cuban regime for 4 consecutive years the legalization of independent trade unions and compliance with international labor standards. The regime continues to disregard all recommendations. Below, I present Ivan's message to us. Thank you.
El señor se ha referido al deseo de la Unión Europea en acompañar a la isla en un proceso de apertura de reforma, pero no ha suscitado avances sustanciales hasta la fecha. Es importante recordar que el 4 de diciembre de 2020, el señor Antonio López Istúriz, en su condición de miembro de la Organización de Asuntos Exteriores del Parlamento Europeo, sometió una pregunta a la consideración del alto comisionado, señor Borrell, dirigida a las violaciones de los derechos laborales en Cuba. En dicha pregunta, el señor López Istúriz se refería al hecho que el acuerdo no incluía artículos que hicieran referencias específicas a temas laborales como negociación colectiva, la prohibición del trabajo forzoso, el trabajo infantil o la discriminación laboral por razones políticas. En aquel entonces el Parlamento preguntaba también, ¿qué está haciendo la Unión Europea para corregir este vacío legal? ¿Y qué medidas concretas se están tomando para incorporar este tema en los próximos diálogos con Cuba? Mientras estas conversaciones han tenido lugar, el régimen cubano no ha cerrado su empeño de perseguir, amenazar y encarcelar a sindicalistas independientes y opositores. Las últimas 4 reuniones del Comité de Libertad Sindical del Consejo de Administración de la Organización Internacional del Trabajo en Ginebra ha abordado el caso 3271 presentado por la Asociación Sindical Independiente de Cuba. El comité revisó los alegatos nuestros acerca de la persecución, contenciones, agresiones y despidos de sindicalistas independientes, entre otros actos de discriminación e injerencia antisindical por parte de las autoridades. La Unión Europea, en sus acuerdos con países de América Latina, ha hecho énfasis en el fortalecimiento de la democracia, los derechos humanos, el desarrollo sostenible, la buena gobernanza y el Estado de Derecho, así como en promover la aplicación efectiva de los convenios internacionales. En este punto hemos observado, por ejemplo, que muchos de los artículos del acuerdo entre la Unión Europea y Cuba fueron reproducciones de los artículos contenidos en el acuerdo de asociación entre la Unión Europea y Centroamérica. Lamentablemente, los artículos del acuerdo de asociación entre la Unión Europea y Centroamérica que hacían referencia específica a temas laborales fueron dedicados parcialmente o eliminados del acuerdo con Cuba. Por ejemplo, el artículo 38, empleo y protección social del acuerdo con Unión Europea-Cuba, es una copia literaria del artículo 42 del acuerdo con Centroamérica. Lamentablemente, en su deseo de iniciar un proceso de acercamiento con el régimen cubano, la Unión Europea no menciona temas relacionados en su acuerdo con los derechos laborales y sociales. Esta postura de la Unión Europea es contraria a la mantenida en otros acuerdos que han suscrito con países de América Latina en los últimos 20 años. Por todo lo antes expuesto, solicito a este ilustre Parlamento considere la revisión del acuerdo con Cuba para que pueda comenzar las verdaderas reformas políticas, económicas, sociales y medioambientales que el régimen político dominante de la isla tiene bloqueado con el fin de seguir perpetuándose en el poder. Muchas gracias a todos.
I'm going to summarize and translate the message of Iván Hernández Carrillo. He is the top leader of the independent labor movement in Cuba. He has spent many years as a political prisoner, I believe 8 years as a political prisoner. And this is Iván's message. The independent labor movement in Cuba asked for a review of the cooperation agreement between the European Union and the Castro regime. He echoes the letter sent by López Istúriz, who is one of the top leaders of the People's Party in the European Parliament, to Borrell Navarro, in charge of foreign policy of the European Union, with regards to the agreement between the EU and the communist regime in Cuba. The existing agreement between the European Union and the communist regime in Cuba does not protect labor rights in Cuba. Iván Hernández Carrillo asks, what is the European Union doing to protect these rights? The International Labor Organization has condemned the persecution of independent labor and the violation of labor rights in Cuba by the existing regime. And yet, while the agreement between the European Union and the Castro regime in Cuba is an almost literal reproduction of the agreement with Central America, while the agreement with Central America includes provisions for the defense of labor rights, the defense of labor rights were excluded from the agreement with the regime in Cuba. The independent labor movement in Cuba calls on the European Union, it calls on Sweden to review this agreement so that labor rights in Cuba are protected and the independent labor movement in Cuba is not persecuted. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And next speaker is Mariano Mena. He's president of the University of Latin America Workers.
Como tú quieras.
Muy buenos días, señores miembros del Parlamento de Suecia, miembros del Parlamento Europeo. En primer término, permítanme agradecer la acogida y bienvenida que dan a esta delegación a los efectos de compartir con ustedes algunas inquietudes referentes a la situación que vive el pueblo de Cuba. Orlando, está cerrado.
Good morning. I would like to greet the members of the Swedish Parliament, the members of the European Parliament, and other members who are participating in this event for the warm welcome they have given this delegation. Today I want to share with you some of my reflections and impressions of the reality of the people of Cuba.
El solo hecho de recibir esta delegación debe ser considerado como un acto de reconocimiento a la lucha por las libertades del pueblo de Cuba y de la clase trabajadora cubana.
The mere fact that this delegation has been received in this manner is a recognition of the struggle for freedom of the Cuban people and is a recognition of the struggle of the Cuban labor class inside Cuba.
Como presidente de la Universidad de los Trabajadores de América Latina, una institución inédita, única en su clase, la cual tiene entre sus funciones la de luchar por las libertades de los pueblos y los trabajadores de América Latina.
I represent the University of Latin American Workers, a unique institution whose core mission is to protect the rights of the workers of Latin America.
Y cuando hablamos de luchar por las libertades, es en todas sus expresiones. Libertad.
When I speak about the struggle for the freedom of the working class, I speak about freedom in all of its expressions.
Libertad política, libertad económica, libertad social, libertad de expresión, que es una de las principales libertades que hoy por hoy no tiene el pueblo ni la clase trabajadora cubana.
When I speak about freedom, I speak about political freedom, economic freedom, social freedom, freedom of expression, which is one of the main freedoms which the Cuban people totally lack today.
Dar a conocer a los trabajadores y a los pueblos de América Latina que somos y debemos ser como ciudadanos, como persona humana, seres pensantes y libres.
We are, as human beings, thinking beings and free beings who have the right to express ourselves.
Dar a conocer los derechos humanos, derechos de la sociedad humana que tienen los pueblos y que hoy por hoy el pueblo cubano de ellos no goza.
The natural rights that any human society has, the natural rights of human beings, which human beings are entitled to by nature, are totally lacking in Cuba today.
El pueblo cubano y los trabajadores cubanos tienen derechos que deben ser ejercidos con y en libertad y que hoy por hoy están siendo conculcados.
The Cuban workers, the Cuban people have rights which should be freely exercised by nature and which today are repressed in Cuba.
El derecho a la libertad sindical, y yo como sindicalista lo debo y lo tengo que decir con propiedad, es un derecho que no se negocia. Los pueblos como el sueco, como los pueblos de Europa, que tienen libertad y en donde los sindicatos juegan un rol y papel de contrapeso en la sociedad, tienen que ser revertidos en Cuba, porque hoy por hoy los trabajadores y el pueblo cubano no tienen derecho a la libertad sindical, a la libertad de negociación colectiva, a la libertad de organización, porque esos derechos hoy son penados por ley. Los sindicatos que hoy hemos constituido en Cuba, lo hemos constituido de manera de hecho, porque el gobierno cubano no les da el reconocimiento de derecho que les reconoce el convenio 87 y 98 de la Organización Internacional del Trabajo. Es decir, el sindicalismo en Cuba hoy es un trabajo de carácter clandestino.
I must say this, as a labor activist, the freedom to organize labor, the freedom to organize labor unions is non-negotiable. The right of workers to organize for a more effective participation in society, as happens around the world, as happens in Sweden, is a natural right that should not be repressed. That right is repressed inside Cuba. The independent labor movements that exist in Cuba exist clandestinely. They exist de facto, even though their existence is recognized by Articles 87 and 98 of the International Labor Organization.
El derecho a la libertad sindical no es un eslogan, no es una declaración que da un gobierno por el solo hecho de decir aquí existe libertad sindical. En el caso de Cuba esto no es cierto, esto no es verdad y en consecuencia estamos obligados a ayudar a revertir para que los trabajadores cubanos hoy tengan esos mismos derechos que tienen los pueblos europeos.
The freedom to organize labor unions is not a slogan. It is not a declaration. It is not a privilege granted by the state. It is a right. That right is not recognized in Cuba. You should not believe that that right is recognized in Cuba. We have to struggle for that right to be recognized and to be used by the Cuban people.
Es inaceptable y debe ser inadmitible que los dineros de los recaudos, de los impuestos, de los trabajadores, de los ciudadanos que hoy viven en libertad, puedan y deban ser utilizados para mantener, sosteniendo un régimen dictatorial en el Cuba que soslaya todos los derechos que tiene la sociedad cubana.
It is immoral, it is incoherent that the money of European taxpayers is being used to repress the labor rights of the Cuban people as well as other rights. The money of European workers should not be used to repress Cuban workers.
Los dineros de los pueblos libres deben ser utilizados para apoyar las libertades en donde ellas no existan. En consecuencia, solicitamos al Parlamento sueco, al Parlamento europeo, revisar a fondo el acuerdo o convenio que se tiene con el gobierno de Cuba, porque los dineros y recaudos deben ser utilizados para apoyar las libertades, para apoyar los derechos de las sociedades, de los pueblos y de la clase trabajadora.
The money of free people should not be used to repress other people. It should be used to support freedom, to support the struggle for human rights. That is why we formally ask that the agreement between the European Union and the communist regime in Cuba be reviewed, as it is financing the repression of rights, including labor rights in Cuba.
Por lo antes puesto, solicitamos, con todo el respeto que ustedes se merecen, revisar a fondo ese acuerdo o convenio con el gobierno de Cuba. Toda vez que los dineros de los pueblos, como reitero, deben ser utilizados para apoyar las libertades, la libertad del hombre, la libertad de la persona humana, la libertad de los derechos sindicales. Los sindicatos en el mundo jugamos un rol y un papel de contrapeso en la sociedad, de contrapeso a los gobiernos dictatoriales, de contrapeso a los gobiernos donde existe democracia. Luego entonces, la revisión de este acuerdo y de este convenio entre el pueblo de Europa y el gobierno cubano debe ser en función de que los fondos, los dineros que lleguen al pueblo de Cuba efectivamente sean utilizados para que se reviertan esos derechos y libertades conculcados al pueblo, a los trabajadores y a la sociedad cubana. Muchísimas gracias.
We formally request, respectfully, that the cooperation agreement between the European Union and the communist regime in Cuba be profoundly reviewed, as the money of the European Union should be used to promote pluralism and freedom. Independent labor unions, independent civil society is a counterweight to the power of any government. Without this counterweight, citizens have no protection. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And next speaker is Luis Zuniga. He is a former Cuban political prisoner who served 19 years in prison.
Is it open? Okay. Okay. Thank you for this valuable and extremely important opportunity to present a truthful and objective overview of a tragedy the Cuban people are living today. The backbone of the well-being of the people of any country is to have liberty and rights. With them, a future is possible. And in Cuba, there is none of them. The important political rights are inexistent because only one political party is permitted, the Communist Party. It controls all the powers of the state. The communist leaders are the legislators, the judges, the administrators of enterprises, the chief of the armed forces, and the chief of whatever of authority is in the country. It means the Communist Party can do anything it deems necessary to maintain its absolute power, and they do it with absolute impunity. Let's look at the economic rights in the island. Following the communist dogma, in Cuba, all means of production are state-owned. Leaders of the Communist Party manage every industry, business or enterprise, banks, financial institutions, and so on. For the people, the regime only issues permits to operate small service shops, which are constantly harassed and subject to high taxes because they must remain being proletarians, which means poor. Let's go now to the area of labor rights. Sadly, I have to continue with the same mantra. Cubans have no labor rights. The traditional Central Union of Workers of Cuba, known by its acronym of CTC, was taken over by the regime. Its mission has been twisted, and the Central Union has become an instrument for the political control of workers. At the same time, they deprive workers of all their internationally recognized labor rights, as Mena already said. But in this area of labor rights, the regime has created agencies which provide workers, Cuban workers, of different trades to any foreign country. For instance, the Commercial Agency of Medical Services of Cuba provides doctors, nurses, and lab technicians to any country. This Commercial Agency of Medical Services currently have contracts with many countries. I am going to use the contract agreement the agency had with Brazil as evidence of the abusive exploitation of Cuban doctors. The Brazilian authorities paid $4,430 a month for every doctor, but the agency of the regime only gave every doctor $400 monthly for expenses and deposited $600 in a bank account in Cuba. So the agency received $4,430 a month per doctor and paid them $1,000, appropriating for the Cuban regime 77% of the wages every doctor should receive. But the abusive extortion is not limited to doctors. The regime has created agencies for this type of offer, to offer sport trainers, seamen. For instance, the agency Selectmar offers Cuban seamen to any cruise ship company under the same pattern of doctors. There are Cuban seamen working in cruise ships around the world. And inside Cuba, the agency ACOREC provides workers of all trades to foreign businesses. ACOREC collects the salaries of the foreign businesses and pay workers 15% of the wage the foreign business pays for every employee. We believe the European Union cannot continue ignoring or brushing aside these abuses after a special rapporteur of the United Nations has classified the Cuban practice as a modern form of semi-slavery. On top of all of the above, the regime owns all media and uses it as an instrument of communist propaganda, not to inform. The little access that internet and social media opened for the Cubans a couple of years ago is about to be closed. Last week, the regime imposed a new law of media that will punish any opinion or social media publication considered adverse to the regime. So the Cuban people will be silenced and isolated again. As for social rights, they are plainly non-existent in Cuba. The mixture of economic disaster and government corruption has produced a severe shortage of all basics: food, medicine, electricity, water, transportation, and housing. Electricity cutoff average 8 to 10 hours daily. Lands overwhelmingly owned by the regime are abandoned. State farms cannot produce because peasant workers have no agricultural tools to till the land. Even water is frequently unavailable for them. Look at the fact that Cuba is surrounded by sea, but the people cannot have fish because the regime does not permit people to have private fishing boats. As for housing, if you go to Cuba, you will find large and luxurious hotels and resorts everywhere. But we'll also see most housing is in deplorable conditions, particularly in the most populated areas. Why? Very simple. The communist regime uses all available construction material to build and maintain their hotel industry, which is, by the way, owned by the military. But no construction materials are sold to the people. The regime itself acknowledges that there is a deficiency of no less than 1 million living units for a population of 11 million people. I may go on and on for hours depicting the tragedy Cubans are living, but because the Cuban communist regime is constantly proclaiming abroad their free education and health care as a cover-up of all its human rights abuses, I want to quickly describe what education and healthcare are really in Cuba. The right to education is absolutely twisted. As no private education is permitted, the regime uses education to impose communist indoctrination. Besides, they demand students to integrate to political organizations of the regime, like the Union of Communist Youth, as a condition to have access to universities or to technical schools. Even more, as if a student or a professor expresses verbally or in any social media platform any opinion adverse to the communist regime or its policies, the student or the professor is immediately thrown out of the educational system. On top of that, after graduation, all students must perform what they call social service, which consists of 3 years of unpaid work. Aren't 3 years of professional work not repaying for the education received? As for the free health care, anyone may search on the internet and see the deplorable state of hospitals in Cuba. I mean, the hospital for the population, because there are some hospitals, in fact, clinics of high quality, but just for tourists, foreigners, and the elite of the Communist Party. Hospitals for the people are so deteriorated that people admitted have to bring a towel, a bed sheet, a bucket of water, a piece of soap, and a light bulb to light the room. I am not exaggerating. Besides, emergency rooms are serviced by students because doctors are massively rented abroad. And if you need a surgery, you must provide from anesthesia to bandages. Otherwise, your surgery goes to a waiting list of months. Besides, what is the value of a medical appointment if the prescribed medications are not available? There have been a chronic shortage of medicines in Cuba for years. At any city or town all day long, you may see unending lines of people just waiting for supplies to get to the pharmacy. Not even basic drugs like analgesics, antibiotics, or pills for stomach disorders are available. However, the regime is exporting medicine abroad. Last February, the regime sold drugs to Mexico in the amount of $80 million. The Cuban people is undergoing hunger, especially people with no family abroad who may send them money. For 61 years, Cubans have been subjected to a rationing of food, clothes, shoes, durable goods, which, by the way, are not available most of the time. The communist ownership and management of the economy have destroyed the producing capacity of Cuba. Before communism, in 1958, the International Monetary Fund recorded Cuba as the 5th largest exporter of Latin America, just behind Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, and Mexico, all of them countries several times larger than Cuba and more populated. However, Cuba today has to import 84% of the food it consumes. The living standard in Cuba is at the bottom of Latin America. Food availability is extremely unequal. Taking advantage of the severe shortages, the military created special markets selling only in dollars and at prices unaffordable to the average Cuban family. For instance, a kilogram of chicken that the regime buys from the United States at $1.94 is sold at $15 to the people. Be aware that the average wage in Cuba is 3,800 pesos a month, which is equivalent to less than $30 a month. The World Bank has set an income of $57 a month as the level of poverty for the region of Latin America. It means that over 70% of Cuban families live under the level of poverty. Another angle of the disaster in Cuba is the huge amount of unpaid debt accumulated by the regime. Before year 2015, when they engaged in the renegotiation of their unpaid debts, the amount owed was estimated in the 70 billion level. 70 billion level. The accurate amount is uncertain because the regime considers economic statistics a secret of the state, so they may continue deceiving the world about their glorious communist revolution. Let me remark that even though most renegotiations were extremely favorable to the Cuban regime, they have been unable to comply with the agreements. And last year, the economic representative of the Cuban regime acknowledged to creditors that Cuba was unable to pay anything. At this time, they are facing a lawsuit at the British High Court from private commercial businesses for no payment. As a whole, the regime owes $1.3 billion to commercial businesses alone. That is the basic reason why Cuba has no credit anywhere. But the regime refuses to implement reforms, and stubbornly they continue expecting that free and democratic countries like the European Union will continue giving them credits and funds so they may preserve their absolute power in the island. It is fundamental to understand that no amount of funds given to the regime shall be enough. Cuba is a black hole. And what will happen in Cuba? It is easy to guess. Social explosion. Less than 21 months ago, on July 11, 2025, tens of thousands of people came out to the streets to protest for all that you already know. They protested peacefully, but in spite of their sole needs, they did not demand food, medicines, or high wages. They demanded freedom. They demanded freedom because they all were aware that it is the communist system the source of all problems. But in spite of a repression, the Cuban people has continued protesting. Keep in mind that on those massive protests of July 11, over 1,800 people were arrested, including underage kids, and 870 people were prosecuted and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 5 to 20 years of prison. Last month, May, there were 274 protests all over the island. So the Cuban people have been protesting and keep protesting. But the regime continues sending its special repressive forces to crush them. But they want their protest to be perceived as a cry of help, aimed not at the regime that is insensitive, but to the democratic world, because democratic countries are the ones providing funds and assistance to the dictatorship, especially the European Union. I will conclude now. The agreement of cooperation of the European Union and Cuba, signed in 2017, provided the Cuban regime over 100 million euros in 2018 and 2019, and over 300 million euros in the longer term. Currently, the European Union is funding 80 projects in Cuba worth 155 million euros. And everyone there knows that those funds are really used for the repression against the people, and the rest goes to corruption. It is time for European governments to freeze its assistance to the communist regime of Cuba and to initiate a revision of the so-called political dialogue and cooperation agreement between the European Union and Cuba, because they are funding a horrible dictatorship. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luis Zuniga. And now we have Herman Tertsch. He is a member of the European Parliament and chairman of ECR Eurolat and member of the Foreign Relations Committee in the European Parliament.
So, hello, good morning to everybody. First of all, thanks. Thanks to the Swedish Democrats. Thank you to the Swedish Parliament. Thank you to the Christ Democrats. Thank you to the government. And thank you to all people who are sensible to this issue, to this question of the suffering, 63 years of dictatorship, 63 years of suffering in Cuba. Not many people are prepared to speak about it, especially because of one question. I mean, Cuba is a very special case. If you see how many of our European democratic leaders have in these 60 years have been pilgriming to Cuba, to La Habana, to see dictators, to see Fidel Castro, who shot innocent people. Hundreds, thousands of people were shot, deprived from their property, destroyed their lives, who were sent out to the emigration in an incredible exodus, in an awful exodus that has destroyed a country which was a really prosperous country in the Caribbean, in America, one of the most prosperous countries in America. And it was completely destroyed in this 60 years of promising socialism and promising the paradise. Today you see the cities in Cuba are like cities after a war. There was no war in the cities in La Habana. And you see it, and it looks like really a scenery of a bombing, and the ruins of a bombing. It was socialism, and time has done it. But it is a fashionable dictatorship, as I say, from François Hollande, Mitterrand. How many of our European leaders have been in Cuba? How many of our European leaders sent their messages to when Fidel Castro died, this responsible man for so much suffering? They sent their condolences to Cuba. All the presidents of the governments of Spain, the so-called democratic Spain, of the European Union, how many of other leaders of these countries have been in Cuba, and have been in Cuba going after the death of Castro, going to this kind of tomb they built for Castro to pay honors to this criminal dictatorship. This is a question we have to ask ourselves, because Cuba has had enormous support of the Soviet Union till the year 90, but the year 90 the Soviet Union disappeared. And why is this dictatorship didn't disappear with the Soviet Union, and it went on, and not only went on, but it created his enormous influence in the whole American continent, and now is really the metropolis of an enormous force, which is the alliance between the organized crime and the communist movement, which is called Foro de Sao Paulo, which is called Grupo de Puebla. We should speak about Cartel de Puebla, because it's narcotics with the communist movement. And that was made from Cuba, and that started in Cuba and jumped over to Venezuela, and they conquered Venezuela with all the oil and Chavez, and so they expanded to Ecuador and to Bolivia, and they had a few years where they suffered, because as they are socialists, they suffered and suffered some defeats in the elections. But now they are back, and they don't want to lose elections anymore, and they have mechanics not to lose elections. And we are seeing there, you have Lula, applauded in whole Europe. And we didn't have any political prisoner in Brazil during the time of Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro, this monster, everybody speaking about this terrible Bolsonaro. Not one single political prisoner. Now you have, months after coming Lula, you have hundreds of political prisoners already in Brazil, and you have the YouTubes and the social networks and so on, continuously cuts and censorship and so on, and you have the Cubans there, and you have the Cubans as they are in Venezuela and control in Venezuela the military and the telecommunication. The Cubans, specialized Cubans. They are now in Ukraine, and they are now in Belarus. They are now here as well. But they are in Spain as well. And they have an enormous influence. And all this, the Foro de Sao Paulo, with all the network, which is narcotics, as I say, the big, enormous business of cocaine. Every country where socialism wins stops eradication of the coke plantation. Expansion. Continuous expansion. Now, last week, now we have a row in Bolivia because two factions of the communist government are fighting each other and accusing each other of sending half a ton to Madrid, half a ton of coke. Nobody had spoken about it in Spain, not even in Spain. In Spain, we have a socialist and communist government, a communist party, which was all of them were trained in Cuba, who weren't trained in Venezuela, who were paid for in Bolivia, who were paid by Correa in Ecuador. That's all this, it's all the same network. And this network is in the Socialist Party, which was in the, in a huge, huge corruption affair of PDVSA, which was the corporation, the oil corporation of Venezuela. Venezuela has the biggest reserves of oil of the world, far more than Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. Under Venezuela, Venezuela has now no petrol, and because that's one of the miracles of socialism. In Cuba, there's no sugar. They exported sugar to all the world 60 years and 70 years ago. Now there's no sugar in Cuba. In Venezuela, we have no petrol. They could make disappear, as they say, the sand of the desert if they get to handle it. And all these connections, and I'm coming soon to an end. All these connections bring us to the influence of Cuba in the whole big political mafia which is now ruling Iberoamerica, what we call Latin America, the whole subcontinent mostly. But yeah, now you have Petro in Colombia. You have Arce and Morales fighting each other in Bolivia. You have Fernandez in Argentina. You have Boric, which was one of the models how the Foro de Sao Paulo destroyed the prosperous Chile, and through violence created the situation that the left would win and create this kind of suicidal process to an assembly, a constituent assembly, to make another state, a magical state with different justices, and a state which has nothing to do with a democracy anymore. And they are being ruined. Crime is soaring in Chile. Everything what distinguished Chile as prosperous has been destroyed by the Foro de Sao Paulo, by this overrunning the democracy by the Foro de Sao Paulo. And all these things come from this little island, which has the know-how of the subversion like nobody else. And they are using it, as I say, they are using it as the point of the bridge between China, Russia, and Latin America, as they did before. As I say, this influence has an effect in my parliament, in the European Parliament. And the European Parliament has the Spanish socialists with a great influence of the Spanish communists, sometimes indistinguishable, in the European Parliament, also in the Commission, and that's Mr. Josep Borrell. And Mr. Josep Borrell is a socialist who was involved in different questions in the time before. It was no obstacle to have him in this very sensitive position by the commission that was elected 5 years ago. And he has been supporting first Iran, and all the time through has his protection on Cuba. We had a resolution, an historical resolution that the ECR promoted, and for the first time the European Parliament said we had to denounce this agreement. This agreement gives only money. The money of the Swedes is going only for repression and for privileges of the mafia, of the communist mafia, which makes an enormous suffering. There is not €1 from the Swedes or from the Germans or from the Spaniards, which goes to Cuba, which goes to the people. Nothing goes to the people. Everything goes against the people for repression and for privileges of the privileged. In this sense, we are going to ask next week for the resignation of Mr. Borrell, because his visit last week in La Habana was the last drop of the indignity when he arrived there, and the only problem Mr. Borrell had in Cuba was to ask the Americans, the United States, lifting the embargo. The embargo, I mean, Cuba lives from the United States, so the embargo is more a virtual stuff. And he asked for the lifting of the embargo in the moment where he had prisoners, political prisoners, making a hunger strike. When the repression is worse, if there can be, worse than in last years, because since the 11th of July, there have been a monstrous repression in Cuba. And he arrives in Cuba as he would be arriving in Switzerland, more or less, saying that he was going around in the square, talking to the people. I mean, the cynical position of Borrell is unbearable, and we will, as I say, we will ask for his resignation in the European Parliament, and we will ask again that we comply with the resolution of the European Parliament, that this agreement that only gives money to evil, to the dictatorship, for the deprivation and deprivation of the situation of the Cubans, that must stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And yes. And now we have Ricardo Ernesto Bodoyo Penat, is a parliamentarian from the Republic of El Salvador.
Morning, everyone. I apologize, my English is not very good. I speak Spanish in this occasion. Hablar del tema de Cuba no es romantizar un tema más. Hablar de la situación de Cuba en la actualidad es hablar de más de 6 décadas de represión, de crimen, de persecución y de cualquier atrocidad que cualquier ser humano en el mundo pueda imaginar.
To speak about Cuba is not to romanticize an old, tired theme. To speak about Cuba is to speak about 6 decades of repression, which cannot be underestimated by any human being.
Como diputado salvadoreño, un país en Centroamérica que también ha sufrido las consecuencias de los oprobios del régimen comunista que emana de la isla de Cuba.
As a congressman of El Salvador, a country that has suffered the consequences of the existence of a communist regime in Cuba.
Un país que sufrió una cruel guerra en la década de los 80 y que fue no solo financiada, sino que también entrenaron comunistas cubanos a salvadoreños, en el cual murieron más de 100,000 salvadoreños a consecuencia de las ideas trastornadas que vienen de ese régimen.
You must understand that my country suffered a terrible civil war in the 1980s. Over 100,000 Salvadorians died. The communist guerrillas were trained and financed by the communist regime in Cuba.
Es por eso que yo me uno a esta causa y por eso decía, no podemos seguir romantizando lo que pasa adentro de la isla de Cuba.
I have joined the cause of a free Cuba, and we can no longer romanticize what is happening in Cuba.
Todos los latinoamericanos y creo que todos los seres humanos en el mundo que tenemos una vocación democrática,
Any human being in the world that believes in freedom and believes in democracy, not just Salvadorians,
debemos unirnos en una sola voz.
we must all unify in a single voice.
Como miembro del Frente Hemisférico por la Libertad,
As a member of the Hemispheric Freedom Front,
un movimiento en el que habemos más de 16 países de Latinoamérica
the Hemispheric Freedom Front includes 16 Latin American countries,
y que hemos tomado a bien el acompañar a nuestros hermanos cubanos que defienden la libertad y que claman, exigen la libertad en Cuba y fuera de Cuba.
the Hemispheric Freedom Front, all 16 countries, all the parliamentarians that are part of it, have decided to support the people of Cuba in their struggle for freedom.
El diciembre pasado visitamos el Parlamento Europeo,
Last December, we visited the European Parliament,
en donde hicimos una petición y la petición sigue siendo la misma.
At the European Parliament, we made a petition which we reaffirm today.
Le pedimos a la comunidad europea, a la Unión Europea, que cese el financiamiento al régimen cubano.
We asked the European Union to stop financing the Cuban regime.
Dinero que es de todos ustedes,
Your money, the European money,
de todos los ciudadanos europeos, que no creo que ustedes estén dispuestos a seguir pagando represión, pagando muerte, pagando persecución a aquellos cubanos que lo único que exigen en estas alturas es libertad.
I cannot believe that European money, that the money of European citizens is willingly paying for repression and persecution.
Vamos a ir a todos los parlamentos, a todos los congresos de Europa que sea posible. Y por eso quiero agradecer a los congresistas Soder, Marcus y a otros que nos han abierto las puertas de este congreso para traer esa voz unificada de Latinoamérica y pedirles que también se unan a nosotros y al hermano pueblo de Cuba.
We are going to go to all the parliaments and congresses that we need to go in Europe to ask for this financing to cease. And I want to thank my colleagues Soder and Marcus for making this possible and for letting Europe know that Latin Americans want this financing of the regime to stop.
Es momento en el que dejemos todas aquellas fuerzas democráticas en el mundo de ver el tema de Cuba como un romance o una historia que está lejos de suceder en nuestros países.
We must stop looking at Cuba as a romantic fairy tale that could never happen in our countries.
Y nos unamos para que este pueblo que todo aquel que ha salido de Cuba y se encuentra en cualquier parte del mundo ha tenido éxito. Los cubanos son una comunidad que llegan buscando oportunidades porque en su país es donde se las han negado y los han sumido en la miseria.
Cubans are a hardworking people who take advantage of opportunity. They have been successful around the world because they have been denied these opportunities in their own country.
No me extiendo más y quiero que el objetivo y el mensaje sea claro para todos ustedes. Es momento en el que la Unión Europea revise ese convenio de cooperación en el cual irónicamente hay cláusulas de respeto a derechos humanos, de transparencia, en el cual el régimen cubano no está cumpliendo ninguna de esas cláusulas.
We respectfully ask for the review of this agreement because this agreement ironically contains key clauses referring to human rights in Cuba, which are being flagrantly violated by the regime in power in Cuba.
Más de 1,700 presos políticos, más de 120 mujeres presas políticas que su único pecado ha sido pedir libertad del 2021 para acá.
There are over 1,700 political prisoners, over 120 women political prisoners, whose only crime is to demand freedom.
Es un hecho que este régimen no puede seguir siendo financiado por ningún país que sea democrático. La Unión Europea tiene mucho para dar en el mundo, ha sido ejemplo para América, pero ya no es posible que siga siendo una fuente de financiamiento para esta represión.
The European Union has been generous with the world. It has done a lot of good, but it should not continue to sponsor this repression.
Llegará el día en el que el mundo entero podrá decir que Cuba es un país democrático, un país libre y un país donde los cubanos al fin puedan tener no solo libertad, sino las oportunidades, y que verdaderamente sea un espléndido país que también pueda ser ejemplo para el mundo entero, como ya lo llegó a ser en un momento.
The day is fast approaching when Cuba will be democratic, when it will be free, when it will be prosperous. It will once again be an example for the rest of Latin America as it once was before the current regime.
Agradecido con su hospitalidad, agradecido el que ustedes estén escuchando nuestras palabras, pero totalmente convencido que sé que de este Parlamento saldremos con voces que se unirán a esta causa y que todos juntos podremos decir viva Cuba libre.
Thank you for your hospitality. Long live free Cuba.
Que Dios los bendiga.
Thank you so much. And now we will have a video message from Emanuel Zingeris. He is a member of the Lithuanian Foreign Affairs Committee and a member of the Lithuanian delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe.
Hello for everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, we can hear you.
That's Miguel. My name is Emanuel Zingeris. I'm an eight-time elected member of Lithuanian Parliament, the head of Lithuanian delegation to the Council of Europe, and a member of European and Foreign Affairs Committees. I'm absolutely glad to see you in Riksdag, Parliament of Sweden, who was one of the first to recognize independence of Lithuania. I'm so glad to see you all you collected yourself for an extremely important subject, is the cementing basis of democratic world. Democratic world should be united like never, facing two major threats from Moscow and from Beijing. I'm an author of a resolution stopping the European Union free trade agreement with Cuba 2 years ago, and I hope that our resolution by Parliament of Lithuania will be shared with our friendly democratic countries, especially in the European Union. I would like you to sign the resolution will stop it uniquely the European Union and Communist Cuba free trade agreement, and the key part of resolution sounds like that. Parliament of Lithuania resolve that the government of the Republic of Cuba may not be encouraged to keep pursuing its current path by remaining quiet on those ongoing realities, and that is not appropriate policy-wise to ratify the political dialogue and cooperation agreement between the European Union and Cuba, and to create favorable conditions for the government of the Republic of Cuba to allow the regime of the Republic of Cuba to continue implementing its dangerous regional strategy and to strengthen the oppression of the people of the Republic of Cuba. Parliament of Lithuania expressed its solidarity with the victims of repression affected by the ongoing persecution targeting members of the opposition, dissidents and citizens demanding fundamental political, civil and economic and cultural rights. At the same time, noting that the Republic of Lithuania is fully aware of new forms of destructive activities carried out by the post-communist Russian Federation and its allies. Declares strong and on unequivocal terms that the regime of the Republic of Cuba and its relations with the Russian Federation, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, as well as the regime support for terrorist organizations funded by drug trafficking, such as the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, and Colombia's guerrilla group National Liberation Army, are the threat to the neighboring states and societies of Latin America. Demands immediate withdrawal of police forces, which are now enforcing illegal home detentions of various pro-democracy activists, independent journalists and artists, including world-renowned artist Tania Bruguera. Express its solidarity with the victims of repressions affected by ongoing persecutions, targeting members of the opposition, dissidents and citizens demanding fundamental political, civil, economical and cultural rights. Noting that the state of Cuba has centralized most of the country's economy and almost all economic activities generating incomes in hard currency, including communications, tourism, and human trafficking of Cuban professionals, particularly of the so-called medical brigades. Adding that the recurrent harsh repression by the regime of Republic of Cuba against, among others, the freedom of thought, expression, press, movement, association, academic research, and religious represents the greatest challenge for the democratic governments which have extended the government of the Republic of Cuba to the benefit of the doubt. I just cited to you, friends, only part of this big extended resolution. Voting was unanimous in the Lithuanian parliament. All parties, including the left parties, voted in favor. I'm representing the Christian Democratic Center-Right Party of Lithuania, who is now in power, and we are ready to encourage our European Union neighbors and the countries in Latin America to follow the example of Lithuania and to produce such resolutions. I hope that especially the Polish Parliament will be successful in having the seventh resolution blocking possible future European Union and Cuba Free Trade Agreement. I welcome your delegation and I will welcome your delegation tomorrow in the Lithuanian Parliament. I'm extremely glad that Björn take so brave position on Cuba. We are terribly struck by 2 days ago receiving news that the Cuban army instructors are training the Russian army to kill Ukrainians. That is probably the last drop in this history of Cuban relations with the democratic world. I think that means that democratic world should find new way to be cemented under the umbrella of NATO and the umbrella of European Union, but at the same time cemented broadly, more broadly, especially in the Pacific, by Japan, Australia, and we hope that we will be capable to convince India finally to vote with the democratic community against Russian aggression in the United Nations plenary sessions together with us. So we are absolutely we are based on huge support and friendship. We have typical relations in Miami with Rosa Maria Payá. And in her environment, we are supporting and having permanent relations with such people from American Congress like Diaz-Balart, Mario Diaz-Balart, and former legal Diaz-Balart, keeping direct relations with Bob Menendez, who is currently head of Foreign Affairs Committee, and we hope that NATO summit during next month on 11th of July and 12th of July will produce Swedish membership in NATO, and we will be capable to congratulate Riksdag and our Swedish friends with membership in NATO. That is very crucial. At the same time, we will be capable to work out formula for future membership of Ukraine in NATO too. And our full support to all political prisoners in Cuba, and our understanding that Cuba information agencies working in favor of Russia in Latin America, we will be capable to stop disinformation spread by Cuba information agencies in Spanish language in Latin American countries, and that the real truth about Russia brutal war of aggression against Ukraine will be explained to all Latin American nations like a war against democracy. So I would like to say, Viva Cuba Libre! We are all behind you, friends, and we will extend our resolution, I promise you, to other countries, to our other parliaments, and I hope that Riksdag will take part in that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for that. And now we will start the panel discussion. Orlando, are you going to join? Yes. Yes. And now we are everybody. And if there was someone that didn't present itself, you can do that. We have Yusuf Audin, a deputy member of Swedish Foreign Affairs Committee and member of the Christian Democrats. Welcome. And Marcus Wiechel, member of the Swedish Foreign Affairs Committee and member of Swedish Democrats. And Joar Forsell, also member of the Swedish Foreign Affairs Committee and member of the Liberal Party. Yes. Okay, and yeah. Okay, we can begin with Herman Tertsch. Is it reasonable for the EU to finance projects that the regime uses to its advantage? And how much time and attention have you been given to this PDCA agreement in European Parliament, considering this 155 million euros?
The thing is, it's not reasonable, it's absurd what is happening. We see it, it's empirical. We have only to see what is happening with the money, and we are seeing that, and we are seeing what is happening in Cuba. The regime in Cuba is in this moment surviving only by repression. They have renounced to improve anything for the people anymore. They have not the means, they have not the way of doing it. It's a complete resignation of every duty of a government. They only try to survive and repress every kind of protest there is. So what we are doing literally is taking the money, the money of the contributors, of the taxpayers in Europe, taking this money and putting it in the hands of people who have a life of privilege and who travel around and who are in one corner of the world and in the other one, and who have the biggest yachts, and they have houses in La Toscana, and they are around, and to the police, which they have for controlling that nobody protests in the country, and putting the people into jail and torturing the people in the jails in medieval conditions. That is what they are using our money for, and we have to present it to the people. I mean, the money, Cuba lives from this money and from the narco money, from the drug money, and from the business with the drug money, with all the terrorist groups and terrorist countries in which they more or less direct or patronage, in the sense of the Secret Service. The G2 of the Cubans is everywhere, and they direct this thing. So the thing is, it's senseless to finance an enemy, and we are financing an enemy who is also in Cuba, who is also in Ukraine, and who is here in the neighborhood in Russia, maybe preparing from Belarus to go to Kaliningrad and cut the Baltics off from the NATO territorially. I mean, we are financing literally the enemy. And I think for Swedes, I mean, this brings the thing very, very much nearer for Swedish and for all Northern Europe. It's not that they are doing things in Venezuela, which they are doing. It's not that they have subverted and destroyed the democracy in Chile. No, they are here. They are here and they are working here. And they are working here with the drug money and with our money. They are working in the neighborhood to destroy our democracies as well. Thank you.
Yusuf Audin, what are your thoughts about that Swedish taxpayers are contributing to this, and what do you do to draw attention to this issue?
Thank you very much. And first, also, I'm very grateful to listening to all of the speakers and your struggle and work to really achieve a more free and democratic Cuba, because we also, the Christian Democrats, actually since maybe 25, 30 years ago have been supporting the democratic movement, and especially the Movimento Cristiano Liberación, led by Mr. Osvaldo Paya, until he died 2012, I think, in a car accident. Yeah. So unfortunately, that was slightly prevented, but we have been supporting this democratic initiative of movement since long time, and we want to see, of course, a more free and democratic Cuba. Regarding this agreement especially, actually we were one of the also parties against, because we thought that it is not focusing and putting harder requirements on human rights and also the democratic reforms. So we are positive of, and also now after a few years where we have seen the, so to say, the practice of the agreement since it was adopted, we see that it hasn't led to any democratic positive reforms. It's more a way for the Cuban regime, the communist regime, to gain some economical support, but they haven't really, so to say, showed any positive signs when it comes to the other part of the agreement, when it comes to human rights and so. So we would like to, of course, put more emphasis and pressure on also the requirements regarding the human rights and democratic reforms.
Thank you. And Marcus Wiechel, how comes that so many countries in the EU signed this agreement? Are they ignorant or what? Or are they not aware? Or what do you think?
First of all, thank you very much. I would also like to show my appreciation for this event and for all the participants. It's a very hard question to answer, actually. I participated in this debate when it was held here in the Swedish Parliament. And just like my dear colleague from the Christian Democrats here said recently, the Sweden Democrats, together with the Christian Democrats, were the first Swedish parties to oppose this when the vote was held in the European Parliament. And here in the Swedish Parliament, of course, the Liberals as well opposed it together with the Centre Party. But it's hard because in this debate, I asked that question to I believe it was the Social Democrats and the Greens. How come you do this even though all the oppositional groups, the leaders for the democratic leaders who opposed the Cuban dictatorship were against this agreement? How come you can still support it? And how come there's a majority in Europe who supports this? And actually, I didn't even get an answer for them, because they said that currently we don't see any success in Cuba, and therefore they wanted to, what they called, try something new. And I think this was quite bizarre, because obviously you can't just give money to someone who oppresses people and continues to oppress people and think that that's going to work, because the political opposition and the democratic activists were not let into this agreement. They were outside from the beginning. How are you going to make that work? It doesn't make sense. So, unfortunately, I can't really answer that question. Thank you.
Orlando Guterres Boronat, what have happened in Cuba since 2016, since this agreement was signed? And is there any form of accountability to report where this money goes? Or?
That's an excellent question. Since 2016, a movement of young Cuban artists, mostly organized around the San Isidro movement, began to mobilize the youth in Cuba, the population in Cuba, especially in Havana, for change. That's in addition to the work of civil society throughout Cuba. The regime repressed and persecuted the San Isidro dissidents and other members of this movement of young artists, leading to demonstrations, unprecedented demonstrations, of hundreds of young artists and intellectuals in front of the Ministry of Culture. This was all met by systematic repression. Finally, on July 11, 2021, there was a massive uprising of thousands and thousands of people, over 200,000 people throughout Cuba, in 50 cities and towns. It took the regime about a week to put down the uprising, with hundreds of arrests. After that, demonstrations have continued throughout Cuba, with citizens closing down roads, protests taking place, and in a very tightly run police state like Cuba, this is unprecedented. There has been a continuous show of resistance. Additionally, 27 Cuban generals have mysteriously died during that period. We don't have objective proof, but we have strong grounds to believe it was a purge within the regime of those members of the military who did not agree with repression. So what has occurred as the regime feels more encircled by the people of Cuba, and through sanctions that the United States government has levied on the regime, specifically on the regime, through the actions of the Cuban American community, as the regime feels more encircled, it relies more and more on its subservience to Putin's Russia. And now with the aggression and genocidal invasion against Ukraine, Putin now needs them also. So you've seen a greater interlocking of their joint efforts, to the point that there are now videos of, and it makes me feel ashamed to say this, of Cuban troops with Cuban flags in Ukraine as part of the repression. So I would have to say that the agreement has been a total failure. The regime has repressed, has increased repression, has become a powerful ingredient of support for the Russians, and especially now in the aggression against Ukraine. So there are more than enough grounds for that agreement to be reviewed and for this funding to be suspended.
Yeah, the funding goes to different projects linked to the Cuban regime. Can you mention a few examples of projects where this money goes? What kind of projects is this?
Money goes to the Federation of Cuban Women. This is not a civil society organization. This is a regime organization which, among its tasks, organizes persecution and repression and public stormtrooper kind of activities of direct aggression against dissidents in Cuba. Money from the regime goes, for example, to the National Association of Small Farm Owners. This title is Orwellian because the regime destroyed the independent farming class in Cuba. So this organization is another front the regime uses to repress and to persecute independent farmers in Cuba. It goes to regime, all the educational institutions in Cuba, with very few exceptions, belong to the regime.
It's not transparent where the money goes.
It is not at all. There is no independent accounting in Cuba. The Cuban people don't know what the budgets of local municipal governments are. This is unheard of in Cuba. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. Joar Forsell, how can the European Union help the Cuban people to get their freedom back?
Thank you, and first of all, I also want to stress my appreciation and for being invited here and for all of you to come here to Sweden to talk on this very important subject. I think that one of the things that we should do is not to have disagreement. And as we have said before in this panel discussion, the Liberal Party and all our parties has been against it from the start. I think it's also, to me, it's very strange and problematic when you have different policies working in different directions. You have, for example, we mentioned Mr. Osvaldo Paya before, and when he was murdered, with him in the car was the chairperson for the Christian Democratic Youth Wing, for example. The Liberal Party has been smuggling forbidden books and had democratic projects in Cuba for a long time. But at the same time, we have these other policies with the agreement, for example, that are working in the opposite direction. And that is a very bad way to do politics. We have to choose the democratic side and go and do that all the way. I also think, to mention one more thing, that with the EU, I think that the situation in Ukraine with the Russian full-scale invasion, and also the situation in China with the growing aggression against Taiwan, to put two other examples, shows that the democratic countries in the world has to stick together. I mean, the Sweden, the EU, other democratic countries, the US has to stick together, and we can't have different policies going in different directions with these undemocratic countries, these enemies of democracy and freedom.
And if this agreement ends and the transactions stop, what approach should the European Union have towards the Cuban regime?
Well, I think that we should seek to have a common approach together with the US and other democratic countries. I think that would be a good way to have a unified democratic approach towards Cuba, towards Russia, towards China, to all countries that are in fact enemies of individual freedom and democracy.
And how is the discussions going to nullify this agreement?
So we're trying to have this discussion here in Sweden, all of our parties, and we're trying to push for it in Parliament and in the Committee on Foreign Affairs. And that's, from a Swedish perspective, that's where it has to start. And I think other European parliamentarians has to answer for the different countries.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You're welcome.
One question only. I want to say it's very important. That's why we are so grateful to Sweden that they have done it in their presidency. It was very important to have it now, and that it has come up, and that we are that's outspoken this scandal with agreement with Cuba, because the next presidency should have been the Spanish one. And the Spanish one is this one, I said it before, where we have still a government, maybe from July, 23rd of July, not anymore. But today we have a government which is a friend and a protector of the dictatorship of Cuba. As Mr. Borrell from the Socialist Party is a friend and a protector of Cuba as well. And we would have a presidency, we would have a 6-month presidency that would be a legitimation and a whitewashing of all the regimes, narco-communist regimes of Latin America. And that was the initial plan when they called now the CELAC. It was a summit of the CELAC with the European Union that they wanted to organize now in July in Brussels, and then in Madrid. Finally, it will be in Madrid, it seems. That is a whitewash of regimes which are impossible regimes, which are contrary to all our values. And they want to do that. It won't work anymore because they are in election campaign, and this presidency won't work. But I wanted to stress the importance of this step of the Swedish presidency for the fight of the human rights on Cuba and on the freedom of Cuba. And this will stay. That will stay permanently as an honor and a very dignifying point of this presidency of Sweden. Thank you.
Yes. And does the EU have any similar agreements with other countries where this has worked? Can you continue? Yeah.
No, I don't, and there is no other agreement in this sense. It's a very special agreement because it is done after we had before that, we had a common position, what it was called, which came from a conservative position of Aznar, which was a conditional approach. That means if the whole European Union had a common position that if there were steps in favor of the human rights in Cuba, there would be a positive reaction to it, but making a wait and see. And that was the position. And when Zapatero came, the socialist Zapatero, with the connections with Chavez and so on, when he came to power, he made the whole operation to get the European Union online on Cuba, because the influence of Spain is so big, for good or for bad. And so for bad, they took the whole European Union position into the Zapatero line. And the Zapatero line was the collaborationist way in which we are now, which came then later. And the conservative government in Spain under Rajoy regretfully didn't change it and was absolutely inactive in this question. So we stayed with Zapatero's position through then to Sanchez, which is a very, very pro-Cuban, a very pro-Venezuelan position.
Luis Zuniga, what's your message to the European Parliament that could help the opposition in Cuba?
Let me say something that is important to understand all this issue around. The left Paris and all the socialist groups, friends of the Cuban dictatorship, have used an approach to have assistance to the dictatorship of Cuba and others using a stratagem, which is engagement. What does it mean? It means that this is the approach. We need to engage with the dictatorship of Cuba just to moderate it, not to confront them, because if we confront them, they will be reactive. So we need to engage with them, help them, and then we'll start moving on and on to the center, so they will start respecting human rights. That's a stratagem, because they will never change. That's quite clear. 64 years of the same. And they keep trying to engage, and they try to give money for corruption, for the maintenance of the power. So the message is quite clear. No engagement at all. That's a wrong policy. The real fact is what legislator Herman Tersch have explained. We have to confront dictatorships. There is no other way, not engagement, no approach. They are decisively, radically in power just to impose the regime, keep them in power, and find naive governments and legislators, providing them the money to stay in power. So the message, I'm quite aware that this is the message the Cuban people feel, and here are a lot of Cubans that came from Cuba just months or years before, and they are aware of what I am saying. That's the feeling of the Cuban people, to the message to the legislators of the European Union and the different parliaments of Europe. Please, stand in front of a dictatorship, don't engage with them, because they are using them. That's it.
Okay, dear friends, thank you very much. I really have to thank you for the panel here for interesting points and remarks, of course, and for the fruitful discussions afterwards as well. Even the fact that it's weird, and I would say it doesn't make any sense to fund the Cuban dictator while you're sanctioning Russia. I mean, a point like that is very important to make. And I believe that we need to all raise this question as much as we can with our colleagues throughout Europe. This issue is undeniably an issue that needs to be raised higher on the agenda within European politics, and I believe that there are many of us here who also are willing to work hard to increase the knowledge of the situation in Cuba and the understanding of the situation in Cuba, here in Sweden, in Europe, and in the world. We undeniably see how various forces do their utmost to relativize or undermine the testimonies that we see from former political prisoners or democracy activists or other people who are currently oppressed by the current regime. We simply must not be naive. And when we see results in form of how the situation develops or does not develop at all, we should be prepared to act. Democracy and fundamental values of freedom must never be ignored. In the free world, we therefore have a duty to guard these values against the destructive and authoritarian forces that are unfortunately growing stronger throughout the world. Especially when we see how a regime like the Cuban dictatorship have done nothing to deserve the honor of being treated as a legitimate leadership. Once again, I would like to thank all of you for participating in this seminar, not least our good Cuban friends and others who have traveled quite some distance from the United States here to participate and to share with us your feelings about this and your knowledge about this issue. Many thanks also, of course, to my good friend Björn Söder, who initiated this important conversation and made it possible. And of course, thank you to Isabel, who has been a great moderator during this discussion. Thank you.